In this part of the seminar, we will deal with the suppression of Holocaust memory in Eastern Europe under the Soviet regime. We will look into national trauma from historical, sociological, and psychological perspectives and examine the relationship between traumatic collective memory to nation building in the context of the former Soviet bloc countries and the Holocaust. Let me introduce Dr. Samuel Barnai from the European Forum at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Professor Jeffrey K. Olick, a professor of sociology and history from the University of Virginia, and Dr. Gina Ross, the founder and president of the International Trauma Healing Institutes in the US and Israel. Thank you all for joining us today. So we'll start with Dr. Barnai. Dr. Barnai, what were the historical, ideological, and sociological reasons that led to the fact that the memory of the Babi Yar massacres and also the Holocaust of the Jews as a whole were suppressed under the Soviet regime?
Well, in the second half of the 1940s, during the Cold War, the Stalinist regime formed its concept of collective memory of the Second World War, or as they call it, the Great Patriotic War. The concept of heroism and sacrifice. The basis of this concept were the following the indisputable postulates. First of all, the Soviet Union defeated the Third Reich, while the role of the Allies and, for instance, the Soviet-German partnership in 1939-41 were downplayed or completely hashed up. The second postulate was the universal, massive heroism and sacrifice of all Soviet people, generally all Soviet people. Thus, this way, the emphasis on special Jewish sacrifice came into conflict naturally with the ideological norms of the totalitarian regime. The very fact of perpetuating the memory of the Holocaust would inevitably lead not only to the discussion of the exclusivity of the Holocaust phenomenon, but also such an issues as the scale of collaboration among the general population and the role of the majority, who actually, under the occupation, they were bystanders. And this was in complete contradiction with the concept of the mass heroism and mass sacrifice.
Gina, can you explain, first of all, what is there such a thing as a collective trauma? But first of all, even what is the psychological definition of a collective memory?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I wanted to start. First with the definition of trauma itself, what a collective is and what collective trauma is. Mm-hmm. And our definition of trauma is when traumatic events, often combined with universal basic needs that are unmet, result in a loss of control and helplessness that can lead to rage and violence. I call collective a group organized around a tribe, a clan, ethnicity, culture, race, a religion, national territory, or vast geographical areas even. And I studied the impact of trauma on society in the last 22 years. I came up with the words of collective trauma vortex, collective healing vortex, collective unconscious, and seeding the concept of seeding the collective unconscious. So collective trauma then results from traumatic events that are shared by a significant number of people in this group or nation, which make them change their collective narrative and take decisions that change their history altogether. These are then stored as painful traumatic memories experienced through the generations and including through epigenetic transmission. And we will see also a pattern of unconscious reenactment very often. And so unresolved collective trauma will distort collective narratives and affect negatively their values and traditions, as we saw around the world. And it hinders the ability to function and to use the resources that are available. And the ability to plan the future is very diminished and paralyzed. Now, at the more serious level, people become hypersensitive to hurt, and they project their fears onto others, opening the way to conflict. And the disconnection from the feelings is what's going to allow for the loss of compassion and the permissibility of real atrocities.
Thank you, Gina. And Jeffrey, from a theoretical sociological perspective, does national trauma play a role? What role does it play in nation building and in society cohesion?
Oh, I think as we just heard, the concept of national or collective trauma is an extremely complicated one and has many different facets. There is an event that's traumatic for many individuals at a particular time, and so then there's a group trauma. But there's also a disruption to collective narratives, the stories that a nation tells itself about who it is and what it is. Of course, whatever happens at the moment gets carried through generations in complex ways. And so the question of the transmission of trauma, for instance, over the course of one lifetime or between one person and their children and their grandchildren, or now even great-grandchildren, makes the story very complex. There's also different kinds of trauma. So just as one is traumatized by the events that happen to one that makes one a victim, there's also the trauma of having been a perpetrator or being associated with a perpetrator identity. It also matters, for instance, what the ongoing structure of social relations is. That is, are the victims still present or are the victims no longer there? It matters whether the flow of information comes from outside. So, for instance, are other countries asking for or insisting on a recognition versus whether it's an internal group that's asking for the recognition. So the concept of collective or social trauma is actually an umbrella or a large basket for a number of distinct processes that are going on at any particular time, and of course over time and through decades or even hundreds of years.
So Samuel, if we take that, what is the story that the Soviet regime was telling itself about the Holocaust for years, and what changed after the fall of the USSR?
Well, from the late 40s till the late 80s, actually the Soviet regime changed. It wasn't was not a kind of immutable monolith. The periods of tightening of ideological norms and the apparatus of repressions were followed by some sort of indulgence, and vice versa. This was reflected in the politics of memory of the Holocaust also. There were years when almost everything was forbidden, except maybe for mentioning the so impersonal so-called victims among the peaceful Soviet citizens. In other periods, for instance, Hebrew and or Yiddish inscriptions, Jewish symbols on the monuments like Magen David or menorah, etc., were prohibited. But but the authorities could permit to mention the Jewish nationality of the victims, or maybe not Jewish nationality, but the fact that the victims were from the ghetto, and everybody may understand the victims from the ghetto, they are Jewish. In addition, we have to take into consideration the local personal factor, and it was of no small importance. Since actually after Stalin and post-Stalin period, more and more powers were transferred from the center to the periphery. And as a result, often decisions to perpetuate the memory of the Holocaust depended on the position of local, maybe regional, city, district leadership.
Gina, how does this process, though, of this repression of memory, or repression of traumatic events, when they're not discussed about, when the story is untold, when it remains buried, how does this impact individuals, and how does it impact a collective on dealing with its past?
Well, it's actually very important in therapy what secrecy does, both at individual levels and collective levels too. It's generally used to safeguard the self-image and the honor and the sense of patriotism of the culture, and to avoid shame and humiliation and guilt and a sense of isolation from other people. And so for the Ukrainians and the Soviet, it was also used to cover their initial collaboration with the Nazis. And also the fact that because of their anti-Semitism, they couldn't give the importance of victimhood of a group whose freedom they were curtailing. It didn't make sense. And again, as we talked about, the panel is talking about, to facilitate assimilation for ideological purity. Now, when you keep them secret, the impact is that there is what I call the collective unconscious murmurs a sense of deceit. There's an unclarity about the historical facts, and in psychology we call it dissociation. It means part of the reality is simply missing, and that leads to a partial sense of the collective self. As we say in therapy, the walls speak. This creates a general malaise in the population, a nervousness, and a reduced sense of well-being, mistrust, and cynicism. It also leads to a lack of sense of authenticity and a lack of happiness, and it will manifest in a lot of alcohol abuse and family and social dysfunction in the culture. In the life force, the vibrancy of the culture is just drained, and its creativity is timed. Also, there is always the fact that there is a fear that the truth will be one day uncovered, and keeping a secret takes a lot of energy, and energy that could be used to rebuilding and healing and functioning, but it's not used that way. And the other thing that happens is that when the truth is finally uncovered, there's a huge sense of betrayal and a loss of trust and a loss of sense of safety too for people. So it affects tremendously the collective.
So that definitely leads us to the next question to Jeffrey. When the truth starts to uncover, when the truth uncovers, what kind of models does this happen in? What kind of models of awakenings from suppressed trauma or national memories have there been? And where would you put the Soviet Union, the ex-USSR countries amongst these models, or what kind of scale can you present? What can you describe?
Well, so first of all, I think it's important to distinguish between repressed memory and suppressed memory. Repressed memory is the memory that we can't ourselves face because it's too horrible, whether it's the memory of something that happened to us or the memory of something that we've done. Suppressed memory is when there is an agency saying, don't you dare talk about that. And these have different effects and operate in different ways. So one of the questions is the extent, and that's not to say that repression and suppression don't interact with each other, that if something is suppressed for long enough, that there's an agency of repression, or that the need for repression leads to not only can I not face it, but I don't want you to talk about it, or I don't want to see it represented in public. So it's an interesting question how these two forms of denial work together and affect each other. The question of what other models and where the Eastern European and post-Soviet states fit in this is complicated. Each is unique in its own way. There's the Tolstoy quote about happy families and unhappy families. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. For me, obviously, right now, the interesting comparison to be drawn is to the United States, which is just now, this week, this year, confronting a long repressed and suppressed memory of slavery, the Civil War, the treatment of African Americans. So for me, the most interesting question is how these stories play out in all of these different countries. What difference does social transformation make? Sometimes the transformation comes very quickly. That is, a regime falls and suddenly the archives are thrown open and we can find things out and talk about them. Other times it's a more gradual process, sort of chipping away at the forces and being a little bit more open, and fits and starts, two steps forward, one step backward. And this happens differently in different countries. It even happens differently in different countries in the post-Soviet states.
Yes, Gina.
There is something called a titration process, like information will come as there is readiness in the system little by little. It doesn't all come all at once. And there are different phases of readiness to bring up the information of any kind, whether it's repressed or voluntarily or denied or suppressed.
So Samuel, can you tell us about these processes, or at least give us example of different processes that have happened of uncovering the truth in post-USSR countries?
Yeah, actually, in post-USSR and all over the East Central Europe, we are facing the same process in different ways, depending on the specifics of each country. What they all have in common is the politics of memory is an essential component of the process of decommunization. The countries are looking for a historical basis of their state national identity. On this path, many of them, actually most of them, often fall into the trap. What kind of trap? On what to construct a national memory. If heroes of the struggle for a national idea during the Second World War stained themselves with the collaboration with the Nazis and or the annihilation of Jews and other minorities. This process is complex and often painful indeed. What to do if the modern national statehood existed before 1990s, before the 1990s, before the collapse of the Soviet communist system, only during the Nazi era. The classic examples are, for instance, Croatia and Slovakia. What to do if a hero of a struggle, a person, against the communist occupation after 1945, before that was a collaborator and or participated in violence against minorities and in particular against Jews. All these questions, each country, they have to solve them in different ways. And unfortunately, in many cases, as I mentioned, they fall into this trap of glorification of the people with not so clean background, to put it middle.
Yeah. So Gina, what kind of effect can these maybe good effects or bad effects can these memory awakenings have concerning the Holocaust? What are the effects and the impacts of them?
I think what the professor was saying is very important, that there are several processes happening at the same time. And I think this is where the concept that I'm talking about, that depending on the readiness and the history where they are, if you think about what happened in Western Europe with Germany, Austria, and France, who belatedly acknowledged that they participated in the Holocaust, it took them a long time to do it, and it's still partial. I mean, you still have anti-Semitism being reborn in those countries that are doing a huge effort and a significant effort for different reasons, for immigration issues that opened up the anti-Semitism, or especially actually is immigration issues that opened it up, and the rise of the right the far right parties in Western society. On the Eastern society, what you have now is that not only did they participate in the Holocaust, but the Holocaust, their countries were the theater where the Holocaust took place. And they suffered, their population suffered much more in terms of both Nazi occupation and Soviet occupation. So they are now in the process, I think, of figuring out their identity. And I kind of see, maybe I'm optimistic, I don't know, but I see it as like they need to first establish that. And if their heroes are guilty heroes, they cannot dismiss them because they are heroes anyway, and they feel that they did something for the nation. And so I'm just wondering if it's not a question of time and process after that is established. And then the next step would be to recognize, you need strength to recognize what you've done. Mm-hmm. And if you're building your strength, it's not the time to do it. This is what we see when we're healing trauma, is that we do it step by step. We need to build a container for it. I have some suggestions later about how that can be done to help people do more reckoning, a better reckoning of their part in the Holocaust. But we need to look at the differences and the different conditions of Western Europe and Eastern Europe.
And Jeffrey, from your experience, can the victims and the perpetrators actually sit together and build? Is there any process that they can be involved in together that actually has an influence and can actually build a new, I would say, identity or a new understanding?
So I would say it matters what generation we're talking about. The victims and the perpetrators at the time or shortly thereafter, or those who experienced it themselves. If you hurt my family or kill my children, there's nothing you can say to me. I don't want to sit at the table with you. There are examples, but that's a different question than when the grandchildren of the perpetrators or victims or bystanders sit down together. This is a different kind of problem. By the same token, there is a complexity to acknowledging the past. So in reaction to the earlier comments, there's a difference between knowing something happened and feeling or accepting that something happened. So we can be aware of something, we can take it on board. I know that in 1943, on the 12th of January, this and this happened, and creating meaning and integrating that into one's individual or national self-identity. There are studies, for instance, that German school children learn and understand that the Holocaust took place and that it happened when their grandparents were alive. But they are certain, even when their grandparents are telling them otherwise, that their grandparents couldn't have been Nazis. They were always on the good side. So there's a difference between understanding that something happened and understanding what it means for oneself and one's community.
And Samuel, has the the awakening, the Soviet awakening, and I would say the awakening or the memory, the recovery of the memory of the Holocaust in the post-Soviet countries, how have they looked differently from country to country? And for instance, how do you see the perpetrators in these countries, not necessarily all of the perpetrators, but who you described, some of them perpetrators, the collaborators taking responsibility? Is there a difference between the countries?
Yeah, it's actually different in different country in different ways. I think one of my colleagues already mentioned it's a question of strongness of the threatening of the civil society and of the regime. To what extent they are strong enough to be able to face this horrible past and to say this person particularly, he is a great hero. We appreciate, we applause to what he did for the national struggle, but in this and this and this period he did such and such mistakes. It's unforgettable, it's unforgivable, but we have to see this person in complexity. It's a story of a national myth as a basis for the national memory, and it's not unique for the East, Central Europe. We have Israeli national myth, American national myth, French, Palestinian, Chinese, Australian national myth. But the question is to what extent the society, not only political level, but the society is really prepared and willing to accept the same person from different points of view, from in all his or her complexity.
Gina, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I also am thinking about that. We really need to look at, we need to develop better rehabilitation program for nations. And this program has to allow the cultures to move beyond the horror that they committed and to be fully rehabilitated. And I think that how they are received and how they're helped along the way will make a big difference. Because also what we have to understand that now anti-Semitism has become the easy go-to scapegoat. And it's a favorite viral meme of hatred and violence for any wrongdoing, any offense, anywhere in the world. It's really in all the cultures. And it has been woven in the tissue of cultures for 2,000 years. And also the fact that it's universal permits less moral shame and outrage. So all of this is impacting what are we going to do about it? There's also what I call like shame fatigue from the Holocaust in certain cultures. That's why we see resurgence of anti-Semitism in a country like the maximum efforts like Germany. And I mean, Western Europe is even more anti-Semitism right now than maybe in Eastern Europe. And so we have to look at what do we have to do there. And my sense is that if we can create guidelines for a perpetrator culture, how to redeem itself, and then once it does that, it completely joins the community of righteous nations because it has done its work. It has taken responsibility, but it also needs to emotionally process the difficult feelings. And I think that part has been missing in most of the programs that have been designed. And there are lots of tools available today that people can use for self-regulation. We know that the nervous system can only handle a certain amount of pain and shame and humiliation. There is no release of it, then it accumulates. And then there is the reaction is to go and demonize or project on our own fears and our own violence onto the victim. I mean, there's all of these processes taking place. And so part of it, yes, we've done just one more second, we've done the reparations, but we also have to ask them to prevent this happening in other cultures. So once they're engaged, we give them like a pathway that's very clear in how to engage in doing this kind of work. And once they're engaged, the process is completed. I think it will encourage many more nations and countries to take on this process right now that is extremely difficult.
Jeffrey, what do you think it needs for a country or a nation to voluntarily take on itself this kind of process which Gina just described? What are the circumstances that will move countries into, that move or would move countries into these processes?
Yeah, so I think there's a dialectic between internal processes and external processes. And one thing that I've learned traveling to different places, confronting difficult pasts, is there's a wariness of other people's or other countries' models being imposed. So, for instance, Germany has a particular history of working through the difficult past and then tries to export this particular model. And it doesn't quite work the same way in different places. By the same token, there's a certain self-confidence in the negative sense that comes as a concept in German, Sündenstolz, pride at repentance. That, well, we worked through the past, we finally confronted our demons, and so that makes us more moral, or it makes us able to bring you along and instruct you on how to do what we successfully did. And we find out that just as in psychoanalysis or therapy, the thing that works for one person or one nation doesn't work the same way. I think back, for instance, to the discussions during the Second World War about how to occupy Germany or how to occupy Japan. And one of the recognitions the United States and the military had in planning for the occupation is recognizing that these were very different cultures and that different strategies of justice would, the same strategy of justice would not work the same in both Germany and Japan, and thus had to be adjusted. And I think that could be said in relation to all of the post-Soviet states. Certainly the Western European model does not work in Ukraine or Poland or Russia, just as the West European model doesn't necessarily work in the United States and vice versa.
Okay, and Samuel, just one last question. How do you think, how is Ukraine different, or is it different at all, from the other Soviet, post-Soviet countries and nations?
Well, when we speak about the post-World War history, the second half of the 20th century, it's really difficult to single out any exclusively Ukrainian specificity in the Soviet policy regarding the memory of the Holocaust, regarding the commemoration, memorialization. In general, the Republican leadership followed the main line, whatever it was, at each specific period. Adjusted to the main line directed from Moscow. In Ukraine, although the manifestation of national feelings were rather harshly suppressed, primarily among Ukrainians. Obviously, they were the biggest and the most important group, ethnic group in Ukraine. They are overwhelming majority. So they're very suspicious during the Soviet time. And this was reflected in a particularly stubborn unwillingness to recognize the uniqueness of the Holocaust in general and the story of Babyn as a symbol of the Holocaust, the main symbol of the Holocaust in Ukraine in particular. And in the post-Soviet period, I can mention, for instance, the Black Book, this sort of collection about the crimes of the Nazis that was actually banned during the Soviet time, but for the first time it was published in the Soviet Union overtly legally in 1991 in Ukraine exactly. So it's already, as I mentioned before, it's a complicated story. During the Soviet time, it's different to figure out any special Ukrainian way to treat the Jewish memory precisely.
Okay, and Gina, and then Jeffrey, and then just one last comment on what do you think is the best, I would say, advice or lesson to be learned about this process that we are seeing in Eastern Europe regarding this, uncovering this past that has been suppressed or repressed for so many decades?
Well, I'm looking at the contradiction between not the revisionism that they're doing and their attempt to have friendly relationships with Israel. So I'm trying to see where we can make the space for the present, what they're doing in the present versus what they did in the past, until they get ready to acknowledge the past in a different way. As I said before, I think the lack of container for the emotions that are of shame and humiliation and grief and hurt and all of that stuff, the lack of container for that, the lack of processing of those emotions, both at individual and at the collective level, are impeding a quicker process. But I think we have to be very careful how we get triggered very quickly by anything that has to do with the Holocaust. And we're very active, and often we're missing the bigger picture of their attempts to be different today in what they're doing. And if we don't make room for that, then we're instigating more anti-Semitism in the population, because just remember, it's there. It's very deeply, deeply ingrained, and it's going to take a while for a true cleanup process. And just look what's happening in Germany, what's happening in France, what's happening in Austria again.
Jeffrey, do you think? Sorry, excuse me, Gina. Yes,
I'm okay. I'm done.
So Jeffrey, just do you think that this process, the anti-Semitism, as we know, still persists and even grows and learns new forms of anti-Semitism, but still, does that mean that dealing with the past how is that intertwined together?
Well, so I would just say that dealing with the past is a long, slow, and ongoing process. In reference to anti-Semitism, I would say that anti-Semitism is protean. It's continually changing, shape-shifting. And the anti-Semitism we have, for instance, in Germany or Central Europe today is not the same anti-Semitism that we had in 1940 or in 1840 or 440 or however far you want to go back. What's remarkable, of course, about anti-Semitism is the way it continually changes and yet remains the same.
Thank you very much for all of these distinguished guests and scholars that we've had with this. Jeffrey Olick, thank you very much. Samuel Barnai, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Gina Ross.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.